let's start by talking about what this is about. And this is about basically narrative in video games, how narrative works specifically in video games, and how it might have some special rules that make it different from another media. And also we're going to talk about the job of the narrative designer when it comes to tell stories in video games. So basically, we're talking about telling stories in video games, and there are like two main elements that two main components. And one of them would be the story, which has a lot of things similar to other media, but the other one is game mechanics, which is probably the thing that makes it different. We'll go through all of this and we'll be talking about that. Many of these things are going to be my personal opinions. But what is this not about? This is not about how to write better narratives, how to write better for video games. For that, you have many other sources better than me, probably. And yeah, basically, my main point of interest here is telling where story and game mechanics or gameplay converge, the things that they have in common and how they can work together to make better stories in video games. Who am I? I'm Alfonso, as I said. I'm from Spain, and I'm a game designer. I've been working as a game designer for 12 years, and I started working in Spain, in Madrid. I made a lot of, in that long time, I worked in so many different things, from MMOs to virtual reality adventures to interactive comics. I've had time enough to experience so many different projects and had so many different learnings from video games. But the core of my career, or what I've invested the most of the time, is in free-to-play games since they actually started being a thing, and that started in social networks, and then it turned to smartphones and what we have now. And yeah, from a few years ago, I've been living and working in Belgrade here in Serbia for Nordeus, and working on some of the titles that Nordeus develops, and I hope you know them because they're great. And yeah, this is a little bit of my background as a game designer. This is important because I'm a game designer, a generalist game designer. I'm not a specifically narrative designer, and I hope that makes it even more interesting just to know about my perspective on this topic. I want to give you another small notes about my background because I think they might be relevant for this topic. One of them is that I had a degree on audiovisual communication. I studied cinema TV, so that you understand that I come from that universe, which is very, very focused on storytelling. And also, well, that's me when I was younger, by the way. And also, I was a game design teacher. I taught game mechanics. I was actually a cool teacher. And that's going to also explain some of my approaches when I'm talking about these topics. I'm going to be giving some references. I'm going to be asking questions, which are probably open questions. They probably don't have an answer. So yeah, that's a little bit of my background. And next. Who is this for? It's for many different type of people interested in the topic, starting from people who are wanting to become narrative designers. I'm going to talk about some basics on the topic, so I hope it's useful for them to get a first contact with what this world is. But also, if you are already a narrative designer and already know everything about it, I hope my personal perspective, also as a game designer and taking into account my specific journey, is useful for you, and maybe we can, I can start new conversations with you guys. Also, if you're a game designer, as I am, maybe from the other perspective, you can understand a little bit better about narrative in games if you are not that focused on it. And in general, if you are a developer for any discipline, if you're interested in the topic, I hope I'm gonna bring some interesting insights for you. And in general, it's for anyone that wants to know anything about the topic. Finally, this is also for me. Again, as I said, I really like this topic, but also because I have the selfish hope that I might influence you in some way. Many of the things that I'm going to talk about are like personal thoughts or my own perspective on the narrative design. And I hope that maybe I will see some influences on the current or future work that you do as a narrative designer. So yeah, one last warning. I'm going to be talking about games, and I'm going to be using examples because it's really valuable to talk about specific examples. And I'm going to use this sign, spoiler alert, when I'm going to talk and maybe give away some details about some games so that you know. So feel free to maybe, while you see this sign, to maybe take your headphones off or something if you don't want to get that specific game spoiled for you. But I'm not gonna go too deep. I'm not gonna spoil too much, but I'm gonna talk about a specific examples. So be aware. Yeah, let's start. Part one. We're gonna talk in general about narrative and how narrative is present in video games. This is a quote by Robert McKee. Some of you maybe know him. He's one of the most famous he wrote one of the most famous books about screenwriting. It's called Story. And he has this very interesting quote about why narrative is important, maybe, why we tell stories. Basically, what he comes to say is storytelling is a means for us to express an idea, to prove an idea, without giving like explanations. You are just structuring story, and that way you are conveying ideas without saying things directly. And that's a very powerful characteristic of a narrative. And if you are seeing the image in the background, probably you know what game this is from. This is Half-Life. And Half-Life was a game released in 1998. And it was considered a revolutionary game for many reasons, but some of them were related to storytelling. One of the main things that people recognize in this game is that it was one of the first games that didn't stop the gameplay to tell you a part of the story and then continue playing. There were no cut scenes. The story was told organically while you played. So you were walking down a corridor, and an on-playing character, an NPC, will tell you parts of the story, and you will be unfolding the story just by playing without stopping to see a cinematic. This was a hit, this game, and it was actually the best-selling game after the scenes came out. So yeah, let's talk about storytelling in games and how storytelling maybe started. Pong is considered by many the first video game, but it's actually not. It was the first commercial video game that was on arcades, but there were like earlier video games. These are two examples that are candidates to be maybe the first video game. One of them is Tennis for Two, and Oxo is the other one. Why am I bringing them up? Because at the beginning, games weren't devices to tell stories. Games were just technological contraptions. In the first case, for example, Tennis for Two was showcased on the Brookhaven National Lab in New York. It was a museum and a lab, a very important one. But to make visits more attractive for people, they had this Tennis for Two just to make it more fun. The second one, Oxo, was just an experiment as an interaction between human and machine. It was a tic-tac-toe typical game, but it was just to prove how an interaction between humans and machine would work. So basically, they weren't conceived as any of these as stories, as devices to tell stories. They were just artifacts that had some technological interest or just were just fun. And a similar thing actually happened with cinema. Because it's true that people think that technologies have a certain use and that's what they are used for, but actually technologies evolve as we use them, and they end up being used sometimes for very different things. Cinema was very similar to video games. At the beginning, it was just kind of a toy, technological contraption that generated amazement on people who were exposed to it. They were showcasing early movies on fairground booths, like or in the circus, for people to be entertained. How amazing this new technology is! How surprising! And this, for example, is the arrival of the train to the station. At the station, it's one of the earliest movies by the Lumiere brothers, and as you can see, it's just something amazing to see when you are not used to seeing images in motion. Actually, there's a myth that people were watching this film in a theater in Paris, and they ran away when they saw the train approaching the screen. They thought that the train would go through the screen and then hit them all or something. And this is actually probably not true, but it proves that it was just something amazing to watch, but it wasn't actually invented for storytelling. But the time passed, and then movies with heavy storytelling component started appearing. The Birth of a Nation is considered the first blockbuster. It set some of the foundations of the filmic language, but also it was a movie that made cinema a medium considered as serious for telling stories. And then, you know, all of you know what happened after, and cinema nowadays, I would say, has become the main generator of stories in our culture. Definitely they were more sophisticated when it comes to tell stories, movies, and yeah, all of us know what ended up happening in this relationship between the new technology and then how it ended up telling stories. Why they ended up telling stories with movies? I don't know, this is a very big question, but as you saw, the possibility of conveying ideas through narration is very powerful. And every time we can represent life in a certain way, and at the same time we can shape it up in a way that we like to convey these ideas, that's a very powerful thing. So it's probably normal that we use any technology to tell stories, which connects with video games. And of course, they also ended up telling stories. Actually, very early, there are like text-based adventures already in the 70s, and probably earlier there are games with stories. But it's true that more and more games are telling more sophisticated and deeper, and they put more investment in stories. And some of them, this is their main selling point, actually. They have like a really, really big story. Probably for the same reasons. It's a new technology that allows us to tell stories. But this is probably my personal opinion. We've been always comparing games to other media, especially to movies. And I think there's a part of it which is like inferiority complex. It's like we want to legitimate games as a medium to tell stories by comparing to movies or to other recognized media. For example, you usually hear, yeah, this story is good. It could be in a movie or in a book when you talk about the story in a video game. It's, to me, a way to legitimate that games can be also good telling stories, as good as the older brothers, which are other media. And you can see that in many of the resources that games use to tell stories. They use the cinematic language, they use the same themes and tropes and other elements like credits, as you can see. They were like relying on already proven mechanisms to tell stories just to feel legitimate as a media to tell story. And also, there might be a reason just to approach or attract people that are not that keen on video games. Maybe they consider them childish, or maybe they are like too complex for me to play. But if you put stories, which is something that other people can relate to from movies and books, maybe you're gonna get more people closer to video games. So why telling stories? There might be many reasons, but the next step would be, and maybe video games are even better than other media to tell stories. And this is probably one very good question for this topic. We're not going to answer it, but we are definitely going to talk about the potentialities of games to tell stories and maybe why they could be better than other media. Many things that you hear when talking about games being better to tell stories is because you are in the story, you are playing the story. That makes the story more intense. You are experiencing the story in a different dimension, a different way. And that takes us to what narrative design is, which is also made of two components. The narrative component is connected to the storytelling, telling the story. And then you have design on its name, which is more about the experience. As a designer, you design experiences for the players. And that's something that probably other media don't have, or at least don't have as intensely as games have. But for now, we're gonna focus on the story. And we're gonna talk a little bit about the relationship between story and narrative, because it's not exactly the same. Many of you will already know this. There is actually this classical split, which differentiates three elements. One of them being story, the other one plot, and the other one narrative. And all of them are actually different. So what the story is? The story is like basically the events, the sheer events that are being told. things that happen and are going to be told in the shape of story. What is the plot? Plot is how these events that form the story are put together in a certain way. They form a sequence, they have relationships within each other, cause and effect relationships in a certain order, and that's the plot. Let's say it's the line that goes through and tells the story. And then narrative is basically how the story is told, all the strategies that the writer or the storyteller used to tell a story in a certain way and not in another way. So basically, to put an easy metaphor would be, if you were about to build a house, the story would be the house itself. The plot would be all the elements that are gonna be put together to build that house, the bricks, the tiles, the shades in the windows, everything. And then the narrative would be the blueprint, how you decided you were going to build that house, what was the strategy to follow. So yeah, basically, the narrative is how we tell the story. And that's not just the story, but the way it's told is not exactly the same. And for telling that story, each media, as we saw, has different tools, different resources. And we're going to be talking about the ones that video games can use. So going back to these two components of storytelling for video games, you have narrative and you have design. And probably the part of design, the part of the unique experience that games can give you are where you can find the most interesting tools. It's true that you can use the same tools as any other media to tell stories in a narrative sense, but apart from the experience, the interactive experience, and we'll talk about that, is maybe more unique for video games. That's basically where the magic can happen, and that can create, tell stories in a different way that other media cannot. So let's gonna go a bit deeper into what makes games different when it comes to tell stories. Okay, this is a quote from a game. Basically it reads, you are still in the hallway, the noise has stopped, but you feel a presence. Someone is in the house. This is from a game which actually it's called Stories Untold, and I borrowed for the title of this talk. And it's a very interesting game because it's an independent game and it's quite experimental when it comes to storytelling. So yeah, spoilers ahead. Please be aware if you wanna remove the sound for now. I must say that it's made of 4 episodes and I'm only gonna talk about the first one, so don't be too afraid. I'm not gonna spoil it too much. So Stories Untold uses a type of gameplay which is basically text-based adventure, like this one. This one is probably the first text-based adventure, and if you don't know how this goes, this is basically a text story, and you interact with verbs to make the story move forward. So you say, walk to the house, and then the story tells you that you're walking to the house. So yeah, in a very much more contemporary way, Stories Untold uses this system, at least on some of the episodes. And the first one is basically you, first person, in front of a computer playing one of these games, a text-based adventure. And you are like unraveling the story. You are saying, okay, this is sending you the story of one guy who goes to his childhood house. The house is empty. And he's gonna go there just to visit it again and remember some of the memories of his childhood. When he arrives to the house is abandoned. Something is off, everything is worn out, the lights don't work. And you are, while in the meantime, you are playing and you are telling this character, okay, then go to the house, open the door, look around, go to the kitchen, go to the living room. At some point, the character in this game hears some sound upstairs. So you say, okay, then let's go upstairs. You go upstairs and in the corridor, you see the door to your childhood bedroom and it's closed. And you're hearing some noises from inside. So you say, okay, approach the door, open the door. And then the game describes how this character opens the door and sees another person sitting in the main character's bedroom, playing some game in some computer. And that game is actually the game you as a real human are playing. This is just a very, very meta way of telling you how you are involved in the story while you are playing a game. And it's a very, let's say, extreme example of what I'm going to talk about now, which is this feeling that it's me. I'm the one who's in the story when I'm playing. I'm the main character in the story. When you are playing games, or when you are talking about a game with some friends, you don't say, you don't speak the same way as you speak when you are talking about movies. You say, for example, this would be a normal conversation. Did you join the Brotherhood of Blood? No, I actually skipped that part. So your experience was very difficult, and you talk about that in first person because you experienced that story personally. You wouldn't hear a conversation talking about a movie, for example. And that's because storytelling in games, it's very tricky, and it's not just being told by a narrator, it's experienced by the player. So it's not just told. And that connects a lot with interactivity. The player uses interactions to interact with the game world, and actually the outcome, depending on the way you interact, changes. That basically is a system. A video game or a game mechanic is a system, and it requires some external energy, some input, and that's the part of the player. The player puts some input in the system does the working, and then there's an output, and that output means a change in the state of the world in the game. So depending on the input of the player, the output can be very, very different. And that means that it's interactive. It gives you a response, and that response might be very different from what other players did before. So yeah, that's basically a simple way to put interactivity, and that's something that defines video games a lot. Having different ways to interact and different outcomes, depending on the way you interact, means that you have different paths when you play a game. For example, in a very small snippet from Super Mario, this could be one path that one player follows, and this could be another one. This is a very micro snippet of what could be happening in the whole experience of playing a game. And basically, this is called actually trajectories. The trajectory that the player follows through the game when you are a designer. And basically, there are as many trajectories as games and as playing experiences that the players have. But having so many different trajectories, not only gameplay-wise, but also storytelling-wise, means that you are going to follow some path, but you are going to miss others. And that makes narrative branching in video games a lot in many cases. This could be a perfect example of an average game and all the possibilities of narrative branches that could be in that game. Imagine that one player is going through the game and they follow this path. That was their decision, and that was the journey that they followed. But all the black dots that you see there is basically what they missed out. And that was elements in the story that the storyteller wrote and put in the game, and they went missed. That's one very defining thing of many video games. And we could ask, is that good or bad? Well, definitely it has to do with the level of control you have as a designer and a writer of an experience. And I mean, it's bad in the sense that you cannot control you cannot make a tailor-made experience for the player. You cannot control all the story beats and when they're going to happen, because you, in many cases, don't know exactly how they're going to happen for that player. What is good? Freedom for the player, that feeling of being able to change things in the game, to make my own decisions, to fill the gaps that you are not telling me from the system with my own fantasy. And that's super powerful, and that's very, very, very unique in video games. It's basically a decision. When you decide how to tell a story, that's storytelling, that's narrative, you make decisions like this when it comes to game. And this is a concept that is pretty much, when you design a game, you're pretty much aware of this. This is the split between progression and emergency, which is actually a spectrum. It's not one extreme or the other. Many places fall into different points of that spectrum. Progression, don't confuse it with the typical progression in RPGs or other games with progression systems where you earn points and you level up. That's progression. But in this case, we're talking about, it's called like that. Progression is about the control you have on how the player progresses through the game. This would be a very, very, very extreme example of a progressive game. In that game, there's only one path to achieve the goal. A game is a sequence of challenges that you have to overcome to reach a goal. And in this case, there's only one way to overcome them, and there's only basically one goal. So there's a lot of control when you design it because you know exactly what the path is going to be, but the less variation and less freedom for the player. And on the other extreme would be this example. For example, this is a more emergent game, a more emergent storytelling. Here you don't have that much control, as we said, but you can offer multiple possibilities to the player and more freedom. One example of games that used to be pretty progressive, because emergency now is like a very big selling point for games. Like you can do whatever you want. You are going to change the world in the game, and you're going to have freedom to do anything. For many games, that's a selling point. But in the 90s, for example, graphic adventures were like the most popular genre, and they were like the top selling genre. You had the graphic adventures from LucasArts or Sierra, and they were the dominating type of game. And they were pretty progressive. There was only one way to solve the puzzles that they proposed. And that allowed them, to the cost of the freedom of the player, they didn't have that much freedom to innovate with how to solve the problems. The storytellers had a lot of liberty to actually write crazy stories. And this is an example, small spoiler. If you haven't played the Day of the Tentacle, this is an amazing game. And the game tells the story, at some point in the game, you travel to the future. And this future is dominated by these tentacle creatures. They are dominating the world, and humans are just pets or slaves for them. And at some point, you get to a contest in which, a beauty contest, in which you have to participate with the cutest human to win the contest. And you find some kind of mummy, and you put a wig with spaghetti, and you make the mummy, you put some makeup on the mummy and some fake teeth, and then you win the contest. This type of storytelling, this crazy narrative, is not possible if you don't have a lot of control about what the player is going to do. Developing each one of these story points takes a lot of effort, and you need to know that it's going to be worth it. So going through all these elements of the storyline, you needed to know that all the players would go through them just to make the experience like full. And these games did that. They were amazing. I love them. But there were some downsides, and most of them were connected to the very nature of video games or what makes them different. This is like a very open topic, and many people wouldn't agree. I love these games and I still enjoy them. But for many people, there was some dissonance between what the story was telling me to do and what I was actually doing, which was point and click. Pointing one verb, clicking one object, and see the result, what the game was telling me. This is what we call action gap, and is that difference between what the story in the game is telling me that I'm doing and what I was actually doing. And in this case, these games didn't, they were like very heavy on storytelling resources or mechanisms or tools, but they didn't put a lot of, depth in the mechanical part of the game or the action in the game, which is something that defines interactivity a lot. So that might be one of the reasons why these games became less and less popular, and some other games with more sophisticated mechanics and actions took over, like adventures, like Tomb Raider, things like that. So yeah, this connects with a very, we said that before that I'm the character in the story. And another thing that you usually listen when people talk about games is I'm playing the story. And that's connected with actions. These are genres in traditional media, cinema, literature. You talk about drama, thriller, comedy, action. And these genres are defined, they're a promise of an experience, but they are defined by the emotions or the type of situations that the story is going to be showing you when you are exposed to them. It's more about the emotions that the story is going to generate. When it comes to video games, these are some examples of genres. It's more about like real-time strategy, shooters, puzzle, survival horror. As you can see, this is not that much about the emotions, but it's more focused on actions, on what you're going to be doing in the game. And then that's the promise they're making to you. So games are very much based on action. They're action-driven. And genres are defined by the type of challenges that you're going to find in those games and the mechanics that are going to allow you to overcome those challenges. So basically, how am I going to solve the problem in this game? That's in many, many cases the name of the genre. Real-time strategy, I'm going to have to make strategical decisions real time to overcome the challenge. Shooter, I'm going to have to be shooting. Puzzle, I'm going to have to be solving puzzles. Survival horror, here you have the word horror, which is more emotional. Could be, I mean, it's part of the genres of the movies and books, but survival is what you're going to have to be doing to overcome the challenge. You're going to have to be surviving. And it's very, very, very much based on actions. This is like a very simplistic draft of what a journey through the mechanics of a game could look like. Now you have a block with exploration, now you have combat, now a cinematic tells you some story, now puzzle, now combat again, now again exploration, and now cinematic. This is a very schematic way to show what the design of a journey could look like based on the mechanics of the game. And then also you can set some pace with this, like some different intensities of or points of interest for the player's experience. You can consider that combat is richer than exploration in this game, is more important. And also you can say that the cinematic, where the story progresses, is even the top in your experience, is what you are waiting for the most and is your main reward. Again, it's a collection of sequenced actions that drive you forward in a game. And this structure is actually maybe a bit outdated, but I would say that many games still follow it. Basically, gameplay is the active part that fills the gap between story points, which is more passive. It's like a cinematic that tells you stories. So you are playing, you are doing stuff, and then story, and then the story develops, and then you continue playing for a while until the next story point happens. This is a very classical structure, and basically means that you have to fill the gaps between story points with some mechanics, and you should make them as fun as possible, because at the end of the day, it's one of the main components of a video game, and many people are going to be looking for the gameplay experience. One of the main actions in games is combat. I don't think we can discuss that. Why everything is about killing in many games? That's the predominant action that you perform in games. I don't know. I don't know if it's about human nature, or I don't know if it's inherited by early toys that games were based on. I don't know. But I have the feeling that it helps to the structure of games. Games are based on challenges and giving you feedback about if you succeeded on overcoming that challenge or not. You won, you lost. And one of the most binary ways to put that, one of the most straightforward ways is this is alive, this is dead. So when you see an object on the screen, you destroy it, the object is not there anymore. That's a very, very clear way of giving feedback. So maybe that's why we use killing as one of the main mechanics in games. It's very clear to communicate that you're doing well or not. That's only a hypothesis. But when you try to fill these blocks of mechanics and action to build the journey of the game, sometimes there might be problems. And this is a very, very famous example, and many people don't even agree with it. But when people talk about Uncharted, in many cases, they talk about this ludonarrative dissonance. It's a cognitive dissonance that happens when the story tells you one thing and you are doing things that don't fit what the story is telling you. This also is related to this action gap that we talked about before. So on Uncharted, if you've played it, or even if you didn't, you probably know the main character, Nathan Drake. He's like an adventurer. He's a good guy. He's a nice guy. And he's not supposed to be a killing machine. But actually in the game, he ends up being that. He kills a lot of people. Combat is one of the main mechanics. And he kills many, many, many people. And that doesn't fit the character, actually. I don't know if this is the case in this specific game, but there are so many games in which this happens. And yeah, basically, in some cases, maybe it's just because you are trying to fill with action and try to make the game long enough to be worth it, or just for the players to feel like they have enough hours of gameplay. So you try to find ways to fill the experience with just actions. And yeah, that put it that way as I'm saying it, that's a very, very, it feels like a very bad example, but it helps me illustrate what I'm going to talk about now, which is the possibility of telling the story through the action. So instead of having cuts while you play and then cut, tell your story and then continue playing, the most interesting thing to me to do in video games, and here you can see I'm a game designer, is using these game mechanics, these actions, to tell the story. You are not telling the story with the traditional ways to tell it, with text or dialogues, but the mechanics themselves are telling the story. And for that, I'm gonna use some example, because experimental and indie games, for probably business model reasons, or for, I don't know, because they are more idealistic when they start making them, are way more innovative when it comes to telling stories in a different way through games and through mechanics. And this is a very, it's a kind of experimental example. This is Passage, but Jason Roder, and sorry for my pronunciation when it comes to names, I might be screwing up. He's a guy who makes very experimental games, and this one is probably the most famous one, and it's called Passage. And I'm gonna tell you a bit how it goes. It's a very small game. You can try it anyway, and I don't think I'm gonna spoil it too much. Passage is about you as a character. You're this blonde guy on the left, and you are walking through life. You are moving from left to the right, and time passes. And you are getting older as you move to the right, but you can also move not only horizontally, but also vertically. And you can explore the level, and the level is intricate, and it's like a labyrinth, and you can go through corridors and around walls and find some chests that give you more points that you can see here on the top right. You find chests, you get points, and if you move to the right, you also get points because you are moving through life. Future is blurry when you're young, and when you get older, the back, the part on the left gets blurry. At some point on this game, you meet a lady, and this, if you choose to go with her, she will join you, and you will be walking together. As you walk to the right, the score increases faster, so you are earning more points from life. But when it comes to exploring this labyrinthic scenario, this level, at some point you get stuck and you cannot cross. Sorry, you can see it here. So when you're walking with the lady, basically if you were alone, you would be able to go through this gap between the blocks, but since it's two of you, you cannot pass, and you have to turn around and find another path. So maybe you are gonna miss some things in life, but on the other side, you're gonna earn more points because you're working together with somebody. Okay, this is just I don't know how deep this is for you, but this is definitely a way to tell the story without using traditional narrative elements, just by using the mechanics. And it's an example that I like. Another example is this September 12th, A Toy World. This is by Gonzalo Frasca. He's a Uruguayan game designer, but also like a scholar of games. He's studying games as a medium. And this type of games is called news games, and he coined that term. And it's they have a very intense political component. And this is just an example of one game he made, his most famous one. This is about fighting terrorism, and then you have this city probably in the Middle East, and then you see some people who are like dressed as archetypical terrorists, and then you are bombing them. So that's mechanics. You are bombing them to kill them, the terrorists. What happens when you do that? That you also destroy buildings, and also people are dying, like collateral victims. And then the rest of the civilians, which weren't terrorists before, they would gather around the destruction that you are making, and they will become terrorists. And there's no way you can avoid that. That's how the system works. And basically, the more you kill terrorists, the more new terrorists are going to be spawning. Okay, this might be controversial, but it's clearly delivering a message, and it's doing it through mechanics, not telling you a typical story with paragraphs and dialogues. And this is another example that I'm not gonna talk about because I love this game. It's one of my favorite games, and it's amazing what they do with also telling the story with the mechanics. So I totally recommend it to you. What Remains of Edith Finch, but I'm not gonna give it away in this case. So yeah, narrating through action. Getting together the two parts, like story and game mechanics, to do something unique that many other media probably cannot do. Okay, this is another thing that you usually hear when talking about games, why they are unique. I'm inside of the story. This feeling of presence, of living things in first person. I'm inside of this world. I'm the character. I play the game. I change the story by playing, and also I'm inside of that world, and I feel that I'm really inside because I can move around and interact with it. This is from Call of the Sea by Out of the Blue. This first-person adventure game, which is about to be released for the new Xbox, and it looks amazing. But also this scene represents very well the feeling that you have sometimes when you feel like you are in a video game. The feeling of being inside of a video game sometimes is just translated as presence, which is I'm inside, I feel physically inside of that world. And that sometimes is confused with immersion, which is what we're going to talk about now. And immersion is not just that. Presence, feeling inside of that world is one part or one type of immersion, but actually there are different types. And we're going to talk about 3 of them following a certain model, which splits immersion in 3 types. A sensory type of immersion, which is all the audiovisual elements of the game that catch your senses. Basically audio, 3D, feeling like this scenario is surrounding me. I feel inside of it. It's amazing. I feel amazed about it. All my senses are activated and I'm totally immersed in that world. This is the sensory type. TV, movies have that too. To some extent, probably many other media. Imaginative. This is the one mostly connected with the story, actually, with the storytelling. This is just living the fantasy, being interested in the fantasy that the game, in this case, is telling you. You are related to the characters. You want to know what happens next in the story. You want to know how it's going to end, and you are super interested in the world that the story lives in. This is just enjoying the fantasy. And this is so much related to traditional storytelling, actually. Literature has a lot of this also. So you can see that immersion is present in other media. The third type maybe is the one that is more relevant for games, which is the challenge-based type of immersion. And this one is connected with the concept of flow, we'll see now. But basically it's that focus that you get into when you are trying to overcome a challenge that requires some skills, mechanical skills, intellectual skills. But you're trying to overcome a challenge and that gets you really, really immersed. And this is probably something that is more intense in video games. I will never say it's only in video games because other media also can have components of this. And not only video games are interactive and not only video games have a challenge, but potentially video games are like the most sophisticated way to drive this type of immersion. Yeah, this is from the SCI model, as you can see, sensory, imaginative, challenge-based. You can find on Google this article. It's like a study about the types of immersion. And this is the concept of flow that you are probably very familiar. This comes up on every presentation about video games ever. But basically just keeping a good balance between the challenge and the skills of the player. So the player is not frustrated on one side or bored on the other side. It's always on that focus, on that nice place to be, and that keeps you immersed. And that connects with playing. We said how powerful stories were. They can convey ideas without explanation. Every technology that we managed to tell stories, we've used for that. So stories are one leg, very powerful, but the act of play is also super powerful. And video games also participate of that in a huge amount. So if we had to classify the different types of immersion by this media, this is very arbitrary and I did it myself, but I wanted to point out is that imaginative and sensory can be on any media in certain or different intensities, but challenge is probably way more present in games. And yeah, immersion in general is very, very powerful because basically skips some rational defense lines that we might have. And when we feel immersed in something, we get in a special state of reception that makes messages and ideas go, as I like to say, through the back door. So when you are immersed, it's more easy. It's easier than the stories are gonna get through the back door with their ideas than if you are just out of flow or you didn't suspend your disbelief. So yeah, immersion is a very, very interesting state that we want to achieve in players so that our message can be more powerful through our stories. And yeah, as we saw, games are very, very, very powerful when it comes to using the 3 types of immersion. And probably they are very, very powerful when it comes two possibilities about going through the back door, as I said. So immersion, actions, and interaction. That's three things that define video games and makes them probably unique compared to other media. We're going to part 3, and this is just a collection of examples of how you can use tools unique in video games to tell stories in an effective way, maybe generating immersion. This is just examples. So I hope it's gonna be just fun to see. This quote is from this game called Celeste. It's an indie game also, and it's a pixel art platform game which tells the story of a girl who wants to climb a mountain. And it's a mountain which is really, really difficult to climb. It's almost impossible for a single person, a normal person, like this girl who doesn't look like having special superpowers or anything. The actual game is a platformer which is very, very difficult. And I'm not really skilled when I play these games, and it was really, really difficult to me to complete it. And you feel like, man, I feel frustrated. I'm not gonna be able to make it. But then you try, and the game, when you try and try, is very rewarding because you end up overcoming climbing the mountain. And actually the underlying topic on this game is depression. Basically the mountain is a metaphor that even if it feels like it's impossible to overcome, you can do it if you keep on trying, even if at some point it feels frustrating. You can relate more or less with these topics, but it really proves that through mechanics and through video games tools, you can really tell deep meanings, and also it's a sign of maturity, in my opinion. So yeah, basically with games, you can use traditional writing as traditional mechanisms to tell stories, but then you have a lot of other tools that you can use, and we're gonna see some examples. First of them is the traditional storytelling techniques, basically writing stories in text or dialogues or building characters with arcs, using archetypes, using like the hero's journey, using the typical structure with 3 acts. All these mechanisms, you can use them also in video games. And then it's a stylistic decision or how you want to narrate it that will make a difference. For example, Mass Effect, you have this codex that is basically an encyclopedia of the universe of this game. It's amazingly well written, but it's basically like reading a book. And on the other hand, you have Dark Souls, which is a dark fantasy game based on combat, but the story is only just brush strokes. It's only implied. It's not told directly. It's like short dialogues, very cryptic ones. Basically, it's not telling you the story explicitly, but you get a feeling of what the universe is and what the history of that universe is. 2 different styles. Again, how to tell is the art of narration, so it's the decisions that you make. But these are just resources that you find on traditional media, like cinematic language, Uncharted games, for example. They use it's like a movie, Hollywood movie, but it's playable, which maybe makes it more powerful. But basically, they're like relying a lot on traditional storytelling resources. But now we go to more specific for video games, level design, for example. This is a very typical example when it comes to telling stories through levels, and it's the environmental storytelling. Movies also have it, but in video games, you can explore yourself. And as you explore one level, you are going to see some details put on that level that are going to be telling you the story. For example, in BioShock, a group of people, elite people, went to create their own society apart from the average person. And it was like a very special society that developed very fast, but at some point something went wrong. And then you come to this place, which is when the party is over. And this very snippet, this very screenshot tells all the story. It was a big party that actually ended in 1959, and now it's a mess and something really bad happened. That's an example of environmental storytelling. More things that you can do storytelling-wise with level design. Setting a promise. That's another typical mechanism to tell stories in other media, but you can set a promise of what's to come to engage players from the very beginning with level design. This is Zelda. That feeling on the Zelda game when you most of the Zelda games, when you go to Hyrule field and then you see all the things that are waiting for you. You see that mountain in the distance, and then you see that castle, and then you know you're going to be playing adventures on all of these places. So that's a promise. That's a storytelling resource that is told by level design. But you can also tell promises with system design. For example, system design, when you create an ability tree, you are telling the player the amount of things they are going to be able to do and have fun with in the future if they keep on playing and progressing. This is another example of setting a promise. Any ability tree is like that, and it's character building to some extent. And also world building, for example. With system design, you can use the resources in your economy to tell the story, to enhance the fantasy. For example, in Dune, the main resource is spice, as it happens in the books. This game is based on a book that you probably know. And spice is the main resource in that book. It's very, very important. And in this story, in the game, is also very important, but also plays a big part on the gameplay, on the system. So you're using any element in the system design just to enhance that story. And another example from system design is sometimes doing some patches on the fantasy. When the fantasy can be broken, you can use the system design to fix it. One very, very big topic in this regard is death. How in games sometimes dying and trying again breaks the fantasy a bit because you are dead. How is it possible that death is not that important? Some games try to find systemic ways to fix this break in the fantasy. And for example, in Sunless Sea, when you die, you are exploring some dark seas. When you die, you start again from scratch with a different character, but that character inherits some of the perks from the previous character. So you are building you are starting with a new character, but you have some of the things that you achieved with the previous character, and then you are getting exploring farther and farther. It's just a way through the system to justify death. And there are so other many interesting examples in game. Now I'm going to talk about how narrative and game design can really, really work together and make the most of stories in games. And this is an example in which I compared the game designer to a minister. And you are the minister of something, and there's a problem or a need that you need to fulfill. For example, you live in a country in which the these flip-flops, which are extremely ugly, have become a trend and everyone wears them, and you don't want that to happen. Yes, and warning, this probably is the worst metaphor ever, so just bear with me. Okay, as a minister, what would you do to solve this problem? One thing you probably wouldn't like to do is force people to don't wear those flip-flops. You wouldn't say, these flops are banned. Some countries could do it, but probably it's not the best way. What you would try to do is finding indirect measures to fix the problem, and then stimulate a change in the behavior to fix the problem. For example, instead of prohibiting the flip-flops, you could lower the temperature in public places so that people are cold and they don't like to wear these flip-flops. They're gonna get their feet cold. Or for example, you do a PR campaign in which you design a new type of shoe, which is gonna become the new trend and it's gonna be better than the previous one. So indirect measures just to fix a problem rather than forcing, in this case, civilians to do something. And for game designers, it's the same. You don't force the player. You don't tell the player exactly what he needs to do or she needs to do. You try to do indirect things to generate some behaviors. For example, if you were the minister of survival horror, you have Resident Evil, for example. You want to achieve this goal. The player must feel vulnerable and in disadvantage, and they must play cautiously. What do you do for that? You give just a limited number of ballots. There are not that many ballots in the economy of the game. It's hard to find them, and their value is very high. So when you play, you're gonna generate this behavior on players. They're gonna be more stealthy. They're gonna try to avoid shooting as much as possible, and they're gonna try to explore as much as possible the scenarios to find more bullets because they are scarce. Basically, you generate behaviors, and that can benefit the story. In a story for a survival horror, just by doing this, you are generating enhancing a lot of the atmosphere and building characters who are weak against the monsters. So this type of way to design can work together with narrative and the narrative designer. And the narrative designer must be very aware of it. Another example that I love, how to build a character. Spoiler alert, this is Shadow of the Colossus. It's a game that I also love. And it's about a very small guy who is fighting the biggest colossi ever. And you are very small. You are like the David against the Goliath. And you have to anyway fight them and kill them. And basically your character is very, very, very weak. And every time you blow your sword against the monster, the Colossus, it really takes a huge effort. So you have to grab the hair and stay there until the Colossus is standing still, and then you have to charge the sword and then blow. And every blow feels like an effort and feels like very valuable. And that's basically putting together game mechanics with the narrative of building a character, who the character is in this universe. Another example, very good example, is Braid. I'm gonna go a bit faster to this because this is taking a bit longer than expected. But yeah, another spoiler, and this might be a big one because I'm gonna talk about the ending of the game. If you know, Braid is made by Jonathan Blow, and basically it's a game that tells the story with the mechanics. You are solving platform puzzles, rewinding. So to solve the puzzle and continue advancing to the next level, you have to rewind to create some kind of combinations in motion and continue walking. And basically you are trying to rescue a princess, which is somewhere, and you are searching for the princess and trying to rescue her. And at some point by the end of the game, you get to the final castle and the princess is there. And then there's this douchebag prince that kidnaps the princess and runs to the right until the end of the level. And you are chasing them, solving these platform puzzles. When you reach the end, spoiler, you have to rewind to complete the level. And when you rewind, which is the mechanic that you were doing the whole game, the story changes. Then you realize that the princess didn't need to be rescued. She jumped onto the prince's arms, escaping from you. So basically, when you rewind, you get the real meaning of the game, rewinding being the main mechanic of the game, which is you are a stalker. And this is maybe my personal interpretation. There are many interpretations about this game, but this is a very great example of how mechanics are telling you, are like twisting the story the last moment, the very thing that you were doing the whole game. So yeah, mechanics can enhance the story. Okay, we are getting to the last part, and this one is going to be quicker. We're going to be talking about the narrative designer's job. What do the narrative designer do? And yeah, this is a quote from another game and also a joke. You didn't make a mistake, and thank you for coming. This is from Papers, Please, another indie game made by Lucas Pope, which is another solo developer. And this game is about basically you're a border crossing immigration officer, and you are basically deciding who gets into the country or not. And it's like a puzzle game, and people come with papers, and you decide if they are okay with going into the country or not. But things start to get a bit more tricky because some people don't have the papers that they need, but they really need to cross the border because their lives are in danger in the other country. And you have to make some ethical decisions. Sometimes you get involved in some terrorist groups, and also you have to do your job well and get some money because you also have to maintain your family. So it gets in a balance that you do your work well to keep your family alive, or you are empathic with people who really need to get into a country. And that puts you in a really tricky situation, very intense ethical dilemma. Basically, again, mechanics telling a very powerful message and a very powerful story. And you can actually resonate with players by doing this. You can create like really, really deep meanings, not just entertaining. That's why I think games are super powerful, because of their unique resources that they have. Okay, so if you are going to be a narrative designer, you're going to be able maybe to do this. And it's good that you're aware of it. So yeah, basically a narrative designer works very close to game design, as we saw on all the other examples. So that means that the narrative designer is not a writer. The narrative designer makes the story playable. And there's a big difference with that. You're not only going to write stories if you're a narrative designer. In a studio, it could look like this. It's a part of story, it's a part of design, and then the game designer and the narrative designer live together. And game designer is more focused on the design and the game mechanics and the gameplay, and narrative designer is more focused on the story part. But as you can see, they're both involved in the other part, story and design. Sometimes there are many other types of designer, and basically narrative designer is another type of designer. And in some cases, it can happen that you have a writer. You have a narrative designer and also a writer. The narrative designer still must be concerned about the mechanics and the gameplay. The writer might not be. Writer can be a person who just is good at writing dialogues or parts of the story, but they don't maybe need to know a lot about gameplay, mechanics, and stuff like that. So again, narrative designer and writer is different. And there might be a full department in charge of the story with a story director. So any structure, I mean, there are as many structures as video game studios. So this is just to illustrate the variety of it. There might be details in which, for example, in some studios, the game designer is not involved in story at all. And narrative designer is like the anchor point between the two worlds. And that's an example, for example, in Telltale games, used to be before they closed. You have this video on GDC video about writing and narrative design. It's very interesting for this topic. And basically, it's a writer and a narrative designer talking. And as you can see here on the right side, when they talk about design, it's responsible for, that's the narrative designer doing those things. And you can see mechanics. Because Telltale games used to be very, very narrative-based, heavy on narrative. Basically, the mechanics were narrative. And it makes sense for them maybe that the narrative designer is almost like a game designer, proper game designer. And then you also have smaller studios or smaller projects. This usually was my case. I've usually been only a game designer without a narrative designer next to me. And usually the game designer then is also in charge of the story. Usually it's games that are not that heavy in narrative, but you can write the story and the narrative design and then connect it with the mechanics. Also, you have some cases, and that happened to me many times, in which at some point you work with an external writer to write some bits of the story because they are going to be better in writing dialogues or they're specialized in one topic, and then you rely on them, usually as external contractors. And in general, you have to take into account that you work in a studio, so it's not only about story and design. There's many people working there, and it's a collective work. Video games are made by many, many people in general, and that means that you shouldn't be so attached to your stories and your ideas, because the final outcome might be very, very different to what you started writing that day in the ideation phase. So be disattached. The collective work brings amazing results. Just if you are going to work in video games, you have to be very, very aware that maybe the story that you wrote is going to end up being a totally different story in the game because it didn't fit the gameplay, for example. And also ideas for games, they don't usually come from you. You are just the narrative designer. But you have to be aware of those things because, again, studios are as different as there might be. But you also have this option, which is total control over everything, like Lucas Pope or Jonathan Blow that we saw in the previous examples. They made their own games, but they also programmed and did the art for those games with some help, in some cases. Yeah, in this case, you have the control over everything, and the story is going to be exactly what you want. But take into account this is a titanic endeavor, and not many people can afford to do this. It's really, really hard. But just to have a full picture of the different scenarios that you can find as a narrative designer. Okay, how the documents are written, how the stories are written, like physically. I'm not gonna go very deep into this. They can take the same format as a typical script for a movie. And yeah, you have this example, for example, Quantic Dreams games, French studio, David Cage being the main creative director or writer. They are famous because they have like over 1,000 pages. That's like 15 or 20 movies length. Imagine if you have a heavy a game very heavy in narrative, you're going to have a lot of pages with all the branches. This format is usually better fitting for cinematics and games like purely narrative, but in general, you are going to have something more like this. And this is something that I did. Actually, this is a script that I wrote for a game. It was an adventure game, like classical point and click, but for VR, for Oculus. And this game is basically a small adventure, point and click. And this is the way I communicated with the rest of the team. I'm gonna take the liberty of opening it and showing it a bit more. I hope you can see this. This is the original document with which I communicate with the, sorry, it's in Spanish because it's originally written in Spanish. And this is the way I will design and also write the story for the game and communicate to the developers. So this is the main view, the objects we're going to interact with. And then you go to the script in which you break down all the possible interactions with the different objects and states. And then you have animations and the dialogue that is going to be triggered when each interaction happens. Then you have the flow of relationships between objects and states. And then you have the pure dialogues and the animations. So this was intended to show the whole, describe the whole design, including the story when it's branching and it's interactive and it's not like a straight line. It can get very tricky. And after doing that, you probably are gonna use some kind of tool like this, which is this is a plugin for Unity, in which you actually put the dialogues and the text inside of the game. Some studios use Unity plugins, different engines. They have like in-house developed tools for creating dialogues, but you are going to have to feel comfortable with dealing with this type of engines. So that's why the more you know about the development world and the more familiar you are with it, the better. And finally, some advice from me, who has the background that I told you, and that's it. That's my experience, and this is the best advice I can give you. You can find different advice in the internet. You have to know your craft to be a narrative designer. Not only narrative theory and a good writer, which is important because you're going to be writing a lot, but also game design because of all the things that we saw before. And also, if you're a gamer, for obvious reasons, better. Also, maybe you can specialize. As I told you, I work a lot with external writers, in this case writers, but it can be also narrative designers, which just because I knew they were specialists in that. They might know about sports or they might know about sci-fi, and you can trust them and they're gonna write a good storytelling for that specific game that you're working on. So specializing might open some doors for you. Build a portfolio. This is probably the most important, and that means basically write. Just first of all, you have to be a good writer and prove it. And also how can you prove it? Writing stories, traditional ones, but also making text-based games or doing some modding in some games. I mean, many people found jobs as narrative designers because they made a mod for one game, and that company hired them because they were really good at making quests for that game. And again, write a lot. To making text-based games, you have a very, very good tool, which is called Twine. Also Ink, you have more of them, but this is very easy to start writing interactive fiction. And that's very good for building a portfolio. And that portfolio, you can probably put it in some free platforms for showcasing your work, like Itchy or Game Jolt. Many people have portfolios, games or prototypes that they made, and they showcase them there. And last, do some networking. Basically, as everything in the world works, the more you know people, the more opportunities you're going to have. And if you sometimes the opportunity can come just because you actually got along with some guy and they trust you already because they know you and they're going to think of you when they're thinking about hiring. But that applies for probably every role in the world. And just to wrap up, please, if you're going to be a narrative designer, and this is like the inspirational part, be aware of all the things that we spoke. Be aware that games create culture. If they are not already, they're going to become like cinema is now. They're going to be the main generators of culture and messages. So you have a big responsibility. Like movies or novels, they shape up how we see the world, how we consider what's good and what's bad, what a hero is like. That's because of the stories we are exposed to. And if they come from a certain point, we're going to be exposed to those and they're going to be believing those. Games are going to be generating this, shaping this view of the world soon if they are not doing it now. So be aware of that. Because they are powerful for all the reasons that we saw, all the elements that you can use to tell storytellings and go through the back door, as I said. And yeah, they can tell stories in a very unique way. You can play the stories and the effect and the impact that they have is going to be way stronger. So just try to make your games resonate with the players and be aware of the power that you have when you're telling stories through games. That's it. Thank you very much. This is it. And now I think we can go and answer some questions if there are. I didn't actually check. Okay, what sources would you recommend for better game script narrative writing? If you are talking about sources as tools to create, as I said, it depends on the studio and the tools that they are using. You have plugins and you have in-house developed tools. And that means it depends. You're going to have to learn. If you're going to do them on your own, you have very, very good plugins if you are a little bit into Unity, or you can actually use Twine as a very good tool to write branching narratives. I don't know if I really answered your question. If it's about sources of knowledge, you have a lot of books and resources on the internet. probably better than me right now. Okay, next one. What point is optimal for branching story in more different directions? Okay, that's a philosophy. How you wanna that's your narrative style. When we saw these branches, there are like different types. You have like the straightforward line, which is like very progressive, and there's only one branch. And then you have like way more open-ended ones. There's one technique which is called funneling, which is like letting the player go and wander as much as they want, but at some point squeeze them into one node, which is the funnel, because you want to actually put them in that node. And that's called like just to make them follow what it's called the critical path. But what's the best moment? I don't know. It depends on how, it's just the way that you want to tell the story. I would say the beginning should be way more narrow, because you're going to set some foundations of what the story is going to be like. And you want to make the player feel safe and confident about what the world is going to be when they continue playing. Okay, when designing a new game, what comes first? Deciding what game mechanic will be used, then film story. Okay, this is a very big question. What comes first, the game mechanic or the story? I was going to include that in the presentation, but it's, I mean, the answer should be game mechanic. When we talk about games, it's usually game mechanic. And if the story, the premise of a story comes first, usually then it translates into a game mechanic, how we can make this a game, and then you continue developing the story. But that, I guess, it depends on who's coming up with the ideas. And if you're making your own game, of course, you have total freedom. But in big studios, usually the idea is more connected to the game mechanics and to the genre that the studio is expert on. And then they will try to come up with a good story. That's the typical way. But again, there are so many possibilities. I would say usually mechanics first. When designing a new game, what comes first? Okay, this was answered. What's your favorite game you worked on and why? Oof. When you work on a game, do you adjust the story to game mechanics or the other way around? Second part, if I adjust the story to game mechanics or the other way around, yes, I adjust the story to game mechanics, as I said on the previous question. But in some cases, as in this VR adventure game, I adjusted the mechanics to the story because the story came given. We needed to follow that story. It was an astronaut going to the moon and trying to find a present there in the moon in the souvenir store. Don't ask me why, but it was a crazy story. But the story came first, and then we had to make it fit in the mechanics. And what happened? Point and click was one of the easiest ways to go because, as I said, adventures give a lot of freedom to writing stories, not a lot of freedom when it comes to game mechanics. And my favorite game, I don't know. I have so many, and in some cases, it's just interactive experiences. The more control I had over the final product, the more satisfied I felt. So maybe this VR adventure was one of the most rewarding ones. But right now I'm working on amazing games that millions of people play, and that's also amazing. So I couldn't tell. Is it possible to sell stories and written narratives designed to studios? It's possible, yes. But don't go sending them your story and telling them, hey, do you want to buy it? First of all, they're not going to read it, because that might be tricky, legally speaking. If they read your story and somehow it's similar to some extent to what they are already working in, they might get on legal trouble. So they are always going to tell you, don't send me stories. And before we read anything or we start talking, we need to sign a document, which is called NDA, non-disclosure agreement, just to make sure that we are safe when we are like, you are going to share your copyrighted creation. You can do that, yes, but it's very difficult, especially if you send it to big studios. If you see the ratio in which games create new games, they are not dealing with new stories every week. Maybe they have a new story they're working on every 3 or 4 years. When it comes to small studios, they really love to create their own stories. So it's very difficult to sell stories. I would sell your craft before selling the story. I would prove that you are a good writer with this, building a portfolio, rather than sending the story and telling them to buy it, because that's not very usual to happen. Are narrative designers and game designers in high demand? Do you need to have a lot of programming skills experience to become a narrative designer and game designer? Are they in high demand? More and more, I would say. Game designers maybe more, because game designers are, as that title said, game designer, as a generalist, there are many ways you can work as a game designer. You can be a system designer, economy designer, quest designer, level designer, gameplay designer. So of course there are more roles, and it's a very specialized role actually. Narrative designer maybe not that much, but you would be surprised about how many narrative designers they use in AAA games, for example. They might be using 20-something narrative designers only for one game because of the weight of the story element in their games. So, and yeah, and games are becoming more and more narrative, and their productions are higher. So yeah, I would say that the demand is going higher, but I would say it's easier as a game designer because it has multiple specializations. What would you recommend as a starting point for someone who wants to get into storytelling in gaming? Starting point, reading a lot and writing a lot. A starting point, it depends. This talk could be a starting point. If you are already interested, you already got your starting point before. If it's about making it more professionally, networking and building portfolio. Find people on Twitter, go to conferences, try to get to know people that work in the business and can tell you how it works actually, and write, and try to write interactive fiction, because that's a very good proof of what you can do. And then you're gonna also hone up your skills if you do it more and more often. Do you really believe in the world-changing power of games? Yes. Considering the most popular games are casual, can casual game change anything? Casual games are already changing things. I don't think they're super powerful, or the ways they change the world is super meaningful, but they're changing the world in the terms that in daily conversations, Candy Crush is already popular culture. I mean, it's gonna stay in history. Everyone is gonna remember that game. Everyone knows about that game, even if they don't play. And also casual gaming is very important as a entering gate to the world of video games. So people who are just playing casual games because they are not threatening at all, they might end up going deeper and deeper into video games and being exposed to more powerful stories. But yeah, I really believe games can change the world, because I believe that cinema is shaping the world already. And as you saw, the journey of cinema is very parallel to games, only that now things go faster. So it's gonna happen sooner. If it's not happening now already, actually. I found that in many games, the branching is usually superficial. Yes, you have some options to choose, but in the end, you end up at the same result. Yes, that's what I was talking about, funneling. So I create the fantasy that you have freedom, and that this is like something that games do a lot. You feel like you are choosing, but in the end, you're going to end up in the point that I want you to be in. That's a very common practice. Yeah, it's not a feeling, it's a mechanism that designers use, because we want you to follow some critical path. We don't want you to miss certain parts. I think that's legit, by the way, because design means that this is the way I expect you to enjoy the most the experience. Okay, games choose not to have strong stories. Okay, they don't choose it. It happens sometimes because the gameplay is more important, but as you saw, games can have actually deeper and deeper stories. Can you name some games that have meta moments, like fourth wall breaking moments, talking to a gamer moments? This game, Stories Untold, basically does that. It's super meta, and it's telling you are the player, but at the same time, you are inside of the game. Another example, Pony Island. That's a very, very good one. Pony Island, you are playing against a video game which is possessed by the demon. I totally recommend it, even if it looks like cheesy and with a unicorn. No, a pony actually. It becomes very, very dark. Totally recommend it. And there are many, but right now I'm not coming up with them. Hello, if we wish to involve environmental storytelling in our games, is it up to us, narrative designers, or does it involve a decision made between the level designer and us? This is a very important point that I maybe didn't make clear. Working in video games is a collaborative thing, it's a cooperative thing. Very few times you're gonna do things on your own. You're probably gonna, every decision you make is gonna involve somebody else, another discipline. So yeah, and if you work together with them, in this case level designers, the results are going to be way, way, way better. So yeah, you should be working with them and deciding together, and then kind of negotiate who's going to have the final decision in certain elements of that specific feature, for example. How much money can you earn being a writer? I don't know. I think J.K. Rowling earned a lot of money writing Harry Potter. So I mean, it depends. If you work in a AAA studio, you're gonna probably have a good salary. It also depends on the country, but you're gonna, I mean, narrative designer is like a proper role with a proper salary. I couldn't talk about figures because it depends on the studio and the country. If you write on your own as a freelancer, probably the rates are gonna be similar, but quite maybe a bit higher, because freelancers usually have some compensations because they are not in the payroll and stuff like that. I mean, it can be a proper job. The problem is not the salary. The problem is maybe the gigs that you find. Do you have discovery research processes in place before working on a pitch and starting development? Yes. Are writer or narrative designers included in this phase? Yes, they should. I mean, research is the first thing that you should do when coming up with a new game, or even feature, or even small bit that you add to a game. You have to research a lot, and designers and narrative designers probably do the most of that work, together maybe with product owners or product managers who do the research just to find problems or needs. Then you're going to do the research to find ways to solve those problems. And yeah, you have to rely on everything that was made before to find the optimal solution. Or yeah, and if you are a narrative writer and you are building you are doing some world building, you have to get a lot of research done. Yeah, and it's super fun, by the way. Do you consider breaking of narrative as always been bad? Thinking of getting players some room of read as one would think. Yeah, this is about, so sometimes breaking the narrative is good. Yes, it's about the pacing. If you think that at this point the game needs breaking the narrative for the player to breathe, that's okay. I mean, it depends on the type of game you're doing. Yes, in general, I would say fantasy is always cool and you can modulate the pace in different ways, but it can happen, of course, yes. For someone that is really just trying to get their first job as game writer, narrative designer, is it enough to have like 2 interactive stories made on Twain? Or probably if you only have 2, maybe hopefully you made 50, and then these 2 are the ones you are most proud of, and they're gonna get you a job. But if you only wrote 2, I mean, there are many people writing, it's very competitive. So probably it's not about the quantity, but the quality, and the quality you only get it by repeating and repeating and repeating. So how many? There's no standard. Just try to make sure that your portfolio is a proof of what you feel proud of and can be sold in the terms of selling you as a worker to a company, or to a company that wants to hire you as an external also. That's a very good way to finding jobs as an external freelancer writer, not all the time trying to find to be part of the staff. What does work day to day on narrative game designer look like? As I said, I cannot answer this question properly because I'm not a full-time narrative designer. I do narrative design when it's needed, or the parts that are needed in games that are not usually heavy in narrative. What is the day to day? It depends on probably on the different phases. On pre-production, or when you're writing the story and you're like crafting the foundations of the story, that's going to be crazy for the narrative designer probably. Later on, it's going to be also intense in terms of making it fit with the game design, but that probably also started happening in the pre-production. Later is, I don't know, at some point probably the story is closed, but there's always problems that you have to solve, and sometimes the mechanics needs to be changed, or you need to remove one part of the game because you are not reaching the deadline, and then you have to again rewrite things. So yeah, probably all the phases are intense, but probably the most intense is the sheer writing at the beginning. But again, I'm just extrapolating this to what the game designer does, and I don't know exactly what the narrative designer does on a day-to-day basis. How important is formal IT education for this profession? I have a diploma in literature, so I don't come from IT field, but I love games, and game narration would make my dream job. Should I learn game design on my own? This connects with a question that I didn't answer before because it was a 2-part question, which is, do I need to know coding or programming or using like technological tools? You don't need to for starters, but it's good that you get familiar to it because at the end of the day, you're going to do it. But to enter the industry, for example, I come from cinema, as I said, and TV, at least my education. And I didn't have knowledge of programming. You get knowledge with time, but no, you don't need it. But the sooner you get familiar with it, the better. But you don't need to have a very mathematical brain. Don't be overwhelmed. I mean, it's not that hard. You can do it, especially for the level of a narrative designer. You can get familiar with even scripts and maybe changing some code, but that to a very easy level. It's affordable for mostly everyone. So don't be overwhelmed about that. Can you name an example of your own game or the game you've been working on and tell us the challenges of constructing narrative in that particular game? Yeah, I mean, I can. I can, but I shouldn't talk about current projects, for example, because it basically it just removes some of the magic behind it. But yeah, I can talk about some failed project that I worked in the past. And that was a game that came up with a mechanic, which was like a scratch and win mechanic. And we needed to wrap it up with some narrative. And the challenges were, again, how to make the story fit with the game mechanics and prove that the concept was valid. And we were super focused on, oh, this narrative is cool now for this mechanic. Now let's flesh out the mechanic. What mechanics can be there? What are the risks, the challenges? If we put blocks here, then the player is gonna need to use this special skill. So you go developing the mechanics, and then at some point, it's not working, and people don't buy it, and it's not moving forward. Like the stakeholders are not deciding to move forward with that project. And then you realize that even when you decided that the story was correct for that game, the story was actually a restraint for that. We were using some kind of childish approach. It was like a little boy in the land of dreams, trying to, solve these puzzles, and it didn't work. And the moment you go to convince people with an idea and you show the narrative wrapping, if they don't buy it, it's very important. So we were so focused on the game mechanics that we didn't realize that the narrative was restraining it, and it was too late when we tried to do something with it. So that game was sacked, as many other games are like killed, and that's a normal practice actually. Okay, do you think that there's a need for mechanical literacy and awareness on the side of the player that game mechanics have meaning on their own? Very, very good question. I understand it for a player, how much the player must be aware how mechanics are important in generating emotions, not just the skill and the mastery and the fun. Great question. If it's like that, if not, also great question. I think it's not necessary. I think that's you, the designer, be it narrative designer or game designer, the one that must put the elements there for the player to go through the experience that you want to generate without him or her being aware of it, of how the gears under the hood works. That I think that's even more effective. When you know how it works under the hood, it loses a little bit of the effect and the fantasy. So I don't think they have a responsibility in that. Quite the opposite. I think you have to craft an experience that seamlessly generates that effect without them having to know. But when it comes to critique games, and many people are now game journalists on the internet, maybe they should know a little bit more about that. Okay. Okay, and probably they are not that obvious, but you would also be surprised how, game mechanics maybe are not that obvious, and maybe that's why they're harder to interpret. Maybe, but in cinema, you would be surprised about the hidden elements that are working under the hood there that people are not aware either. Okay. What is the most optimal, the most probable way to becoming a game designer? Because I believe there's no formal school or knowledge. Well, there is more and more formal education on game design. Actually, I was a teacher on specifically game design in Spain. In Spain, you have like 1 or 2 universities teaching that as a bachelor degree, and also you have some master studies. If you go to Canada or the United States, that's pretty common. Many of the universities include it in the programs. And I know that there are like attempts and endeavors to do it in countries like here in Serbia. Formal education is important and it's going to give you a good foundation. But the best way that you can do it also is on your own. Apart from maybe having a good education, that's always going to be valuable, but you can also educate yourself. If you want to be a game designer, there are several ways to get in. You can come from other disciplines. Many programmers end up being designers. And testing is a very typical door to stepping in game design. You start as a tester, and once you make it into a company, maybe you start in marketing or community management. I actually started in community management. Once you are inside, then you can prove that you can do some other things. And then if you want to do game design, for example, if you are inside, it's going to be way easier for you because they already know you and they trust you and you already proved your value. So my main advice, education is cool, it's very important. It's going to give you tools, but also try to just enter the industry using whichever door you can use, and then try to make your path inside. It's going to be easier. Shadow of the Colossus, I mentioned it. It's one of my favorite games. Why? Yeah, my favorite narrative point from that game. If I talk about why I love it so much, I would have to spoil a little bit the ending. But one of the reasons is what I showed here. I mean, the way it represents what you are doing. This action gap in this case is not that much because you really feel like you are like blowing, like using the sword against the Colossus. It feels like an effort. It feels like a physical effort. And that way of using mechanics to make me feel like the character, identify to the character and feeling the struggles that the character is feeling, I love it. I think it's genius. And also it's because it's a very exceptional game in the sense that instead of filling the game with a lot of different things and side quests and other mechanics and climbing and puzzle and dialogues and stuff, it's just focused on killing the Colossus. It's the only thing you do, apart from collecting some salamanders on the path. The only thing you do is killing the Colossus, and it's so focused on those mechanics, and those mechanics are so polished that the experience to me it's really, really cool. And the soundtrack is one of the best ever. And the ending is very good also, but I'm not going to spoil it. Do you think that funneling takes away from the weight of player decisions that come before it? What might be some ways around it? It would be the same answer as I gave before. You as a designer, you are deciding what's the best possible experience for the player. So that's your decision. If you think that at some point you have to take them, narrow down their freedom and take them to the critical path, that's probably for a reason. And there are some games that are just rewarding and fun because they're just total freedom, but some others just work better if you funnel things a little bit. Ways around it. If you mean hiding the funneling, there are many ways. You can create the fantasy of freedom in so many ways. Ways around not funneling, just using different systems, making it more emergent and then giving more freedom to the player. And if you think that's going to work with your game, perfect. Suggestion for a meta game, someone wrote the question. Stanley Parado. What do you think about that game? Oh, awesome. Yeah, that's a very, very, very good meta game. One of the best, actually. Play it. It's amazing. It's a conversation with the player and what decision-making entails when it comes to making decisions in playing a game. It's awesome. I love it. Good, very good example. Maybe a basic question. What is your general opinion about bad effects on video games? Do you think they have done more bad than good? Yeah, I didn't want to talk about this. We kind of talk about violence and killing mechanics as the predominant ones. Bad effects of video games. I have an opinion, which is pretty much, I don't think games make people do stuff. I think weapons do people do stuff. I've been playing games for all my life, and many people I know do, and we are not thinking about killing people. And even when I'm playing a game and I'm killing people in the game, I don't feel, wow, it would be so cool to do it in the real world. I don't even think, wow, it's a very good idea that I'm playing this game so I don't have to do it in real world. No, I don't feel that need in the real world. It's not even that I have a rational filter in not to do it in the real world. The things that the games depict are fun because I'm exposed to them in a fantasy world, protected. That's the good thing of fantasy. But I wouldn't like to experience them in the real life. So no, and I think when these things happen and they are connected to movies or games, it's more like a social problem, starting from the fact that people have guns at home. What do you prefer? More open-ended, ambiguous storytelling, Journey, Dark Souls, Inside? Yeah, Journey and Inside are also very, very good references. I couldn't put all of them in here. Or more focused planned stories, Last of Us, Uncharted. I prefer, I mean, both of them are pretty progressive. Not Dark Souls maybe that much, but Journey and Inside are games which are like, they don't have a lot of variety. I mean, you're following a path and basically there's only one path, even if there's some fantasy that you can roam around and stuff. So this is all more about the style of narration, and I prefer Journey, Dark Souls, and Inside. I really like Last of Us. It's amazing, and the writing in the game is like top quality. But I prefer things that are only implied, and I can make my own fantasy in a way that fits me better. What is it a good source? Website, online courses, books to learn more about game design? Okay, I think online courses, as many other courses, you can use like, I think it are called MMOG or something like massive open something. You have free courses for many people in places like Coursera or EDX or Udemy. You can use those for learning a lot of different stuff if you are looking for courses. One source that I used to start getting familiar with the industry of video games and learning a bit is Gamasutra. That's a very typical website, and they talk a lot about many disciplines, and including design. And you have very, very nice articles. And also GDC is very, very generous when uploading videos. So you have talks about the most weird topics when it comes to games development. So GDC channel on YouTube is also a very, very good source. And one thing that I did also was very useful, more like when I was getting more into the indie game world, is Twitter. You pick a selection of indie developers, and follow them on Twitter. And some of them are talking about their dogs and how they made a cake the other day, which is not interesting to me. But in many cases, they are sharing very useful stuff about game development and personal experiences. In ageism present in this field of game development, when it comes to storytelling, I don't know. Probably yes, storytelling techniques are always evolving and developing, and some techniques are outdated soon. Yeah, for example, when Half-Life came out, then just stopping to show you the dialogues of an NPC was a bit outdated and boring. And now you have, especially indie games developers, doing very, very innovative things, which are probably gonna become standard and make other things age or be outdated. I think in video games, ageism is something that has happened always in every aspect of it. Yes, but I don't think it's very punishing when it comes to styles that were in the past of storytelling in games. I think many games still use techniques from the 90s or early 2000s. Are there any tools you would recommend for narrative design, or is it just Word and Excel? Well, as I said, if you want to write interactive fiction, and that's a good way to building up a portfolio and also a habit of how to write branching narratives, Twine or Ink, those are good tools. Another thing you can do is getting familiar with Unity and light scripting, and maybe you can start prototyping your own games, which can have some storytelling. But when it comes to tools and it's about writing, it's the best way that you can communicate with your peers. So if you think that the spreadsheet is going to be the most effective to communicate with a programmer, spreadsheet B. Writing, it's using Word or documentation software. Yeah, these are basics. But when it comes to tools, for at least the rule that I apply is think about the target of that document, and then use the tool that is more easy for that person to understand and use that document in a productive way. I don't know if I did answer your question, sorry. When you think about the game with the best storyline, what is the first game that comes to your mind? Well, in games, honestly, I love stories in games, but the games that are super heavy, explicit with the story, like screenplay, I don't have that many references. I still didn't find stories in games that are way better than books that I've read or movies. And that's my personal opinion, and that's something that I think we have to do a lot about when it comes to writing for games. But I can think of games that were more for example, Inside, or I don't know if you play the Return of the Obra Dinn, which is also by Lucas Pope, the same guy that made the Papers, Please. And the narrative in that game, the story is super good. Okay, it could be, not something that I haven't seen before, but the story is really cool. But the way it's told, and that's not storyline, it's just you make the storyline by playing. Another example of playing the story, telling the story with mechanics. That game is genius. That game is something genius, unique. The Return of the Obra Dinn by Lucas Pope. That's a great game, storytelling-wise. What is the name of a book that you recommend? Basics, in general, for game design and the power of play, A Theory of Fun is the most typical one by Ralph Costa. With that book, you're gonna understand why games and playing is powerful, and it's a very easy book to read. Just to to be able just to, I think he uses the metaphor that he's now able to explain his grandfather or somebody, not to be ashamed of what he does because games are important. So that's a very good book. It's a typical reference. Other books, I don't know. I like to read, you have Homo Ludens, that's like an anthropology social book. This is not about games, it's about playing. And this is an anthropological journey about how games shape humanity, and that's how you understand how powerful they are. But in general, I would recommend more like blog posts by developers that tell the stories and how they approach game developing. For example, what's the name? I'm not gonna remember now. Sorry. I will try to remember, but if I don't, look for your favorite indie game developers and read their blogs and read the stuff that they write, because Jonathan Blow, for example, has amazing talks. Jonathan Blow, who made Braid, amazing talks about how he makes video games, for example. Yeah, but this is not only one book. For example, I have this book here, which is how to write the ultimate guide to video game writing and design. It's cool, it's very cool, and some ideas are very cool, but it's just this type of manual, like how to do things, type of books is not usually the most impactful for me. Usually what I appreciate the most is personal approaches to how to deal with design or development. And that I find that maybe more often in videos on the internet and an article. Okay, I think that's it. Cool. You have my mail here, by the way. If you want to contact me, feel free to do it. If you need anything, any further information, or I can help you with something, feel free to contact. And that was it. I hope you enjoyed. I enjoyed a lot, and I really like to be talking about this for hours. I can tell you I would have made it even longer because I had more things to talk about. I'm happy that some of them came up during the questions and answers. And yeah, and that's it. Stay safe. Thank you for being here, and hopefully see you soon in person if it's possible one day.